Years ago, I read something interesting about color blue, and it made quite an impression on me. According to this article, blue was the one of the last colors that was given a name, while other colors like white, red, yellow were all given names with a spoken and written language. A word indicating blue appeared much later than all the other colors. Some scholars suggest that that's because blue was the color of sky, a color too ubiquitous even to have a name. Apparently, this is true with all the ancient languages, where the word representing blue appeared far later than others. I imagine for those who lived without the word representing blue, the concept of blue was much more than a color. It was the color of sky, color of heaven, forever changing and mysterious. Or perhaps people didn't really know what they were looking at, since the concept and the word for blue didn't really exist. So, with this musing, I would jump ahead and say blue is universal. It's universal because most of our ancestors, no matter where they lived, were unified in not seeing blue as a color. My interest in indigo came by chance. Back in 2013, I met a textile artist and a farmer living in the mountains of Japan. Brian Whitehead was a Canadian expat living in the old silk farmhouse surrounded by unkempt tea field. He grew silkworms, indigo, and tea. He took care of his mulberry bushes so he can use the leaves to feed his silkworms. For about 45 days of every year, he fed the silkworms every morning. From the moment they hatched from their tiny eggs until they formed cocoons, he tirelessly fed and fussed over them. And with the cocoons, he reeled silk thread using old spinner. He would go out to the surrounding mountains and field to forage, dye plants, and use them to dye the silk thread he spun. And with that dyed silk yarn, he would weave the most precious and beautiful silk cloth. In summer, he would cut indigo plants from his field and lay them in his shed to dry. It would take him about 9 months to ferment the indigo and make indigo dye stuff called sukumo. In between these projects, he would invite people into his old farmhouse to do week-long workshops. And in May, he would trim the tea bushes with villagers. It took me several years and a half dozen trips to his farmhouse to see parts of all he does every year. Brian came to Japan to teach English in the 1980s, but ended up in the depopulated village of Japanese countryside. He chose to become an artisan. I had been a conceptual artist until that point, and spent a great deal of time thinking about art and what is perceived to be visual art. As I looked at what Brian was doing, my attitude toward art started to change direction. I must have been about 8 or 9 years old. I took a calligraphy class, which was a mandatory class at my elementary school. Something clicked in my head when I first picked up the calligraphy brush. There was a whole set of rules and rituals in calligraphy. Your posture, how the brush should be held in your hand, how the ink and the paper was to be prepared, and the way you breathe while you write. All of these were equally important. There were strict standards when it came to materials that you use and the speed you prepared your ink. When all the rituals were observed in an accurate manner, an acceptable quality of calligraphy could be achieved. The action of writing itself only took a minute or two, and the finished work wasn't valued as a completed work. What was valued was the ritual itself and everything that enabled an immaculate execution of that ritual. I came to associate creativity with rituals, more specifically, putting one's mind to a specific state, going to that special place in your head. Until I met Brian, my creative endeavors always involved going to that special place in my head, which meant conceptualizing, thinking, planning before a quick execution. After I saw what Brian was doing, I realized that special place which enabled that perfect ritual need not be only a metaphysical space. It could be an actual space, a space in which the ritual can take place. Everything you pick up through your senses, what you eat, who you speak to, what you touch, what you hear, somehow makes their way into what you create. Everything you do, everything you will do, and everything you have done gets reflected in your creative activity. This is why when a group of people looking at the same still life each paints a picture, you can usually tell who painted which painting. The first time I visited Brian's workshop, I was working with an American design company. I've never done textile design up to that point, but this company gave me an opportunity to come up with a concept for their textile collection. As part of the project, I became familiar with Indigo. After the textile collection project was over, I continued to seek out and spoke to any artisans who I found interesting and who was willing to speak to me. In old Japan, indigo textile was a highly specialized business with a clear division of labor. Indigo farming and fermenting was done by indigo farmers. They also sometimes offered dip dyeing services where local population brought in their old war clothes to be re-dyed in indigo. Tsukumo, fermented indigo dyes that made by indigo farmers, would then be sold to dye houses. Pattern textile was dyed at koya, a Japanese term for indigo dye house. These dye houses were ran by artisans who usually inherited their trade. At dye houses, paper stencil or katagami was used to glue up patterns on cotton fabric. Then the fabric was zip dyed in indigo. Katagami, or the paper stencil, were made by another set of artisans whose specialty was only to carve intricate patterns from handmade paper. With indigo dyed cotton fabric from koya, seamstresses would make summer kimono called yukata. Yukata was staple for everyone, especially for commoners. Due to such wide demand, indigo dyeing business was booming for centuries. But it was also highly competitive business. Each dye house specialized in certain patterns and technique, often zealously guarding his trade secrets from his competitors. Samurai class wore indigo dyed textile with their armors. Farmers and workers of various trade also wore kimono, dyed with indigo. For farmers, it was said that indigo dyed clothes repelled pests and staved off disease causing evil spirits. Surprisingly, this mythical power of indigo was proven partially true when the modern scientists discovered Japanese indigo plant do have the properties that makes indigo dyed textile resistant to the growth of surface bacteria. Coupled with stencil technique, patterns on indigo garments became a signifier of clan identity, occupation, and class. Social rules of clothing were often strictly enforced by governing class. During Edo period, indigo dyeing craft flourished with astonishing level of skills accumulated over generations. There was obviously a lot of love between Japan and indigo. From what I understand to date, Japan has the most well-documented techniques of making and using indigo. Indigo blue is a color that can be extracted from various species of plants. Japanese indigo plant is just one of many plants from which blue pigments can be extracted from. Extraction method also can vary from location to location. Each countries and regions have their own unique way of extracting indigo from local plants. Comparatively speaking, Japanese indigo extraction is rather laborious and time-consuming process. It takes about 9 to 12 months from sowing the seeds to completion of dye stuff. Seeds are sown in spring, then matured plants are harvested, dried, and fermented. Fermented indigo plants are made into dye stuff called tsukumo. Fermentation process required perfect conditions and experienced hands. There are experts whose job is just to spray water and to till the drying leaves 20 times over 100 days. The yield is also relatively small, meaning you get very little dye stuff per acre of indigo field. Compared to indigo plants grown in Southeast Asian countries, Japanese indigo plants has rather small amount of extractable pigment in it. Cultivating indigo and making tsukumo was backbreaking work. I met young indigo farmer dyer a few years ago who told me he ended up in a hospital for a few days due to the exhaustion at the end of harvesting season. Indigo dyed garments were results of communal and seasonal works, a cooperative working system between farmers and artisans. And in old Japan, indigo was one of the few colors worn by both lower class and higher class of the society. For that reason, contemporary Japanese indigo brand touts its working class roots. During last century, with industrialization and invention of chemical dye, indigo dyeing business inevitably started to disappear. But last 15 years, there has been a conscious efforts of Japanese government and Japanophile to promote Japan as the place for heritage denim brands. For many decades, Japanese indigo traditions passed down in dye house families. With the demands for traditional indigo way down, many of these artisans turned to teaching. To make the ends meet, they taught their craft to hobbyists and crafters. As the interest in sustainability in fashion grew, more people came to learn, first in form of Japanese housewives and the local DIYers. Then the textile students and designers came to learn, as did international denim heads, hipsters, and culturally curious. Today, Japanese brand of everything indigo is enjoying a cultural renaissance. One of these ultra-hip Japanese indigo brand is Capital. With its small batch production and the overworked designers who actually hand make many of Capital's clothing, Capital gained an international following of celebrity clients. Namesake's reference to Karl Marx's book, Das Kapital, seemed to give nod to the idealization of working class, while companies' marketing references the lifestyles of post-hippie era hippies. While the history of Japanese indigo had a firm basis on agricultural life of farmers, Capital's successful marketing offered a vision of carefree nomadic youth.